Good morning. It's been quite a few years since I've been with you on a Sunday morning, so it's a joy to be back. I recognize quite a number of faces, and there are some that I do not. So maybe we'll have opportunity to please shake hands or do whatever we do later, but it's good to be here among my brothers and sisters here in Wembley. John and I have quite a long history together. We were students a few years ago now, wasn't it? It's 40 years ago, which that we graduated from the British Bible School. I think we were about 5 years old at the time. But that sounds like a long time, but for some of you that may sound like an eternity. But the time has flown by, and it's been a very, for me anyway, it's been a very enjoyable friendship that we've had, and so it's always a pleasure to be here, to be teaching with John. And if you weren't here yesterday, I think you missed what was a good day of study. We've been working our way fairly rapidly through the book that we call Hebrews, towards the end there of our New Testament scriptures. However, fear not, because next weekend we're going to be back Friday evening and then again on the Saturday, and we're going to be looking at the second half, as it were. But I'm sure there'll be a little bit of recapping and what have you. So let me encourage you, if you are at all able to come out either on the Friday evening or on the Saturday or both. And I presume there'll probably be some more food next weekend as well. So that's, if you need such an incentive. But let me encourage you to do that. We're here today, are we not? Because we love the Lord Jesus. We have made a decision. We've made a commitment to follow him as his disciples, as his students. And I just want to encourage us to take opportunities that we have to sit and listen and discuss the Word of God, that we might grow in our knowledge and understanding. I want to read to you a story. It's one of those that probably ought to begin once upon a time, but it doesn't. But it could just as well. There was once a man who had two sons. The younger one said to him, "Father, give me my share of the property now." So the man divided his property between his two sons, and after a few days, the younger son sold his part of the property and left home with the money. He went to a country far away where he wasted his money in reckless living. He spent everything he had. And then a severe famine spread over that country, and he was left without a thing. So he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him out to his farm to take care of the pigs. He wished he could fill himself with the bean pods the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything to eat. At last, he came to his senses. And he said, "All my father's hired workers have more more than they can eat, and here I am about to starve. I will get up and go to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against God and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired workers. So he got up and started back to his father. Well, he was still a long way from home when his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, threw his arms around him, kissed him. The son said, I have sinned against God and against you. I'm no longer fit to be called your son. But the father called to his servants. Hurry, he said, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, shoes on his feet. Then go and get the prize calf and kill it. And let us celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead, but now he's alive. He was lost, but now he has been found. And so the feasting began. In the meantime, the older son was out in the field. On his way back, when he came close to the house, he heard the music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, what's going on? Your brother has come back home, the servant answered him, and your father has killed the prize calf because he got him back safe and sound. Well, the older brother was so angry that he wouldn't go into the house. So his father came out and begged him to come in, but he spoke back to his father. He said, look, all these years I have worked for you like a slave, and I've never disobeyed your orders. What have you given me? Not even a goat for me to have a feast with my friends. Oh, but when this son of yours returns after gobbling up your estate on prostitutes, you kill the prize calf for him. My son, the father answered, you are always here with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be happy because your brother was dead and now he is alive. He was lost, but now he has been found. And that is one of the most beautiful stories that I ever heard. The story of love and compassion and so much more. You know, there's devotion, there's honor, greed, selfishness, wild living, hatred, jealousy, and even a little bit of sex thrown in for good measure, though you might not have noticed that. But it's a story of contrasts, from stability to desperation, from squalor to sumptuous feasting. It's got a little bit of everything. And yet for all of that, it has long worn a title that is both ambiguous and possibly also a little distracting. The phrase prodigal son has certainly found its way into fairly common usage, but just what does that word prodigal actually mean? I mean, it's not exactly a word that most of us use on a daily basis, I suspect. Well, simply speaking, the word prodigal means wastefully extravagant, as in when you spend money or use your resources freely and recklessly. And that's just what the younger son did in the story. I mean, he really was, terribly prodigal. Before we immerse ourselves into any of the details here, return if you would, with me to the beginning of the story and take a look at the context in which it is set. And if you want to find it in your own Bibles, you'll probably find it there in the middle of Luke's Gospel in chapter 15, if you have it. Jesus had told a couple of stories about things being lost and then found, and the joy that follows the finding of that which had been lost. The first was about a sheep that was lost, and then the joy of the shepherd, which he shares with his friends and his neighbors once he brought the sheep safely home. And the second story was about the joy of a woman who finds a coin which she had lost, a joy which she also shares with her friends and neighbors. And the joy of the shepherd and the joy of the woman stands in stark contrast to the grumbling of the religious people who were always criticizing and finding fault with this storytelling teacher from up north in Nazareth. As the tax collectors and the sinners were gathering close to Jesus, people like you, people like me, as they were gathering around Jesus, the scribes and the Pharisees were hovering nearby. This religious elite, or so they thought, they considered themselves as being so much better than everybody else. They thought that they alone were truly righteous, at least in the eyes of God, and in their own eyes. That's how they saw themselves. And they looked down upon anybody else who had gone astray. And they certainly looked down upon Jesus, the teacher from Nazareth, because he freely entertained the company of the downtrodden and the outcast. He loved the losers, as they said, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And they saw that as a fault. Yeah. Well, the acceptance of sinners, of those generally looked down upon and rejected by the religious leaders, it's a rather prevalent theme that runs through Luke's gospel, and it's in Luke's gospel alone that we find this story, the story of the compassionate father. Incidentally, and I'm throwing this in for free, just for you here, okay? There's no extra. This is on the, if you enjoy the writings of Luke particularly, and I particularly enjoy the writings of Luke, I have a little podcast, I call it In Context, and we're working through the writings of Luke. Let me know if you might be interested in that at all, because I'd be very happy to share that. We've not got to this point yet, but we will do very shortly. But it's in Luke's writings alone that we find this story, the story of the compassionate father, and it really is a most beautiful story. Had I have been around at the time, I might well have thought that it was being told about me. But then had I have been around at the time, I probably wouldn't be here now. So let's take a closer look at what's going on in the story, because there's a couple of bits that are a little bit confusing, but hopefully they'll be less confusing in a few moments. The Jewish law required that the firstborn would receive a double portion. So the youngest son, we're told that there were two sons, one was older than the other, who was younger than the first. The youngest son would receive a third of the estate. Now, it's likely that Jewish tradition that was later written down in what became known as the Mishnah, it's likely that Jewish tradition allowed for the father to give away capital or property whilst retaining control of the income from the capital until his death. I mean, that's a little complicated. If you're a lawyer, you might get it more than the rest of us. But this is probably the sort of thing that's happening here in the story. But of course, it is just a story. But for listeners to be able to identify with the story, I mean, it needs to be based on some sort of credible reality. So they're listening, they understand what it is that's going on here. And for reasons that are yet to be disclosed, the youngest son goes to his father and asks for his share of the inheritance. Now, it's difficult, at least for me, it's difficult to think of this happening in any way other than that with which we might be familiar. But it's unlikely that he simply, handed him a check or transferred the funds into his account. There would have been some deed or some means of identifying who owned the which property. And it's likely that the youngest son took this deed that he had been given and then he sold it for cash. The new owner would essentially not be able to take possession until the death of the father, who, as we suggested earlier, would have retained the management of the property and the use of its proceeds. But this is just a story, okay? Now, whatever the details, it seems evident that the son had little regard for his family, and he was quite happy for the estate to be broken up. It also seems quite evident that he had little concern for his own future, because he takes the proceeds and he heads off to a distant land where he squanders every penny. And as we've said, he really was an exceedingly prodigal chap. Now, a number of years ago, I set off on a jolly long journey to a distant land. I took a train from my local railway station, which happens to be in Peterborough, all the way to Beijing. But when I say that I took a train, there were in fact a number of trains involved along the journey, plus a boat. But the point is, it was a jolly long journey that took several weeks, and I found myself eventually an awful long way away from home. However, I did not consider myself, at least on that occasion, I did not consider myself to have been particularly prodigal. I'd already purchased a return ticket home by aeroplane, and my temporary Oriental lifestyle was anything but extravagant. But of course, the same could not be said for the youngest son in our story. Once he finds himself away from home, he discovers opportunities and pleasures that he had perhaps never even considered before leaving his family. And there in that distant land, he squanders his wealth in reckless living. Later, it would be said that he had wasted, one version uses the phrase, he gobbled up his father's estate on prostitutes. I mean, what a terrible waste that is. His family inheritance spent on a few moments of short-lived pleasure. What a waste. I mean, it's a tragic story, is it not? And maybe, maybe some of us can identify with that in one way or another. I'm sure there's probably a lesson here for those who are moving away from home for the first time. And the lesson is, be prepared. The thing is that we're often far more vulnerable when we're in unfamiliar surroundings, on enemy soil, so to speak. And the younger son certainly was far more vulnerable. It might also be worth bearing in mind that for a Jew, the idea of a distant land was particularly significant. Jerusalem was seen as the place where God lived. And so the further away one went from Jerusalem, well, the further away one became from God. That was the train of thought. But of course, this isn't how it actually works. The prophet Jonah had shown quite clearly that it was simply not possible to run away from God. Wherever you go, he's already going to be there, which is actually a jolly good thing, although some may not think so at the time. But for this younger son, if he thought that he may be further away from God, being in this distant country, then he might have found it easier to think of doing things that he would never have dreamt of doing as long as he had been back home. Well, things are only going to get worse. Not only does he find himself destitute, but he also finds himself in the midst of a famine, all alone, totally broke, among strangers in a foreign land, starving to death, ridden with shame, devoid of any sense of worth. He really wasn't in a very good place. And with famine in the land, food prices would be through the roof. And the only work that he could find was feeding the pigs. And for a Jew, one could hardly think of a less desirable form of employment. I mean, not that feeding pigs is necessarily particularly desirable for others, but for the Jew, it was virtually unbearable because pigs were ceremonially unclean. The rabbis would say, "Cursed is the man who raises pigs," and a lot of other things too. I mean, what would his family have thought of all of this? And for all of this, he may have found some form of shelter, but he was still without adequate food and still without any friends, for nobody gave him anything. He really was in a very bad place. And I suppose there must come a point in our lives that we realize, when we realize that we are not what we ought to be. I mean, not only are we not what we should be, we're not what we could be. We may not be ready to make a public confession, but as we look at ourselves in the mirror, we see a soul in desperate need of help. We've messed up. I mean, really screwed up in our lives. We've wasted opportunities. We know what it is to be a real loser. And for the younger son, that time was now. The prophet Jeremiah once wrote, "Jerusalem remembers in the days of her affliction and wandering all the precious things that were hers from days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the foe and there was none to help her. Her foes gloated over her, they mocked at her downfall." And now, just as Jerusalem remembered, here in our story, the younger son remembers things of old. As none came to his help in the depths of his desperation and despair, he remembers the precious things that were his from the days of his youth. How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough food, he thinks to himself, but I'm starving to death. Finally, he comes to his senses. He remembers just how good things used to be. And even though he had no delusion that they would ever be quite as good again, he knew that there was more than enough food to go around. So he says, I will get up, go to my father, say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Take me on as one of your hired hands. That was the plan, and it really was his only hope in all of this. Well, I really don't know about you, but maybe we have no glorious past to recall how good things once were. Perhaps they never were that good for us. Maybe we have a childhood that we would rather forget. Whatever our past, we may still come to realize that there is a life so much better than we have been living. There's a real hope that out of all of the darkness and the desperation, there might yet be a better life ahead of us. But first, there needs to come that moment in the mirror. You know, there's something about the rehearsed confession of the younger son that I find particularly refreshing. There's an honesty about it that recognizes the reality of his despair. I have sinned, he says, against heaven. I no longer deserve. My actions, our actions have consequences, which we may not like, but which are the result of our own stupidity and for which we must accept responsibility. There was no attempt on behalf of the younger son to blame anyone else. There were no excuses. There was simply an open heart longing for acceptance once more. And I suspect that the use of the word heaven in this context is to stand for God himself, and perhaps it suggests a further degree of humility in the face of his failure. But it's the use of that word sin that's maybe worth considering for a moment. It's an interesting word, but it's not a word that's in regular usage in this early part of the 21st century. I think it would be fair to say that the word is generally understood in the sense of being a violation of some rule or command, maybe in some sort of a legal sense, you know, that sinners are those who've broken the rules and what have you. But that's not really the full picture. And it might even be a little misleading at times. The idea conveyed by the word is of missing the mark. It's the idea of simply not being what we should be. And rather than try to identify all the violations or so-called sins of this younger son, as if that could be possible, would be better to understand his confession as an acknowledgement that his life was really a complete mess. Whatever deeds he might have done, he had been he'd been selfish, he had been unfaithful, he had been foolish, he had been reckless, and probably a whole lot more besides. Sin isn't just about breaking rules and regulations. Sin is about dishonoring God. It's about violating the trust that God has placed in us. It's about spurning his love. It's about disregarding our fellow beings. And the thing is, every one of us, we're all in it together. None of us is better than anyone else. We've all sinned in as much as we've all missed the mark, and we've all fallen short of what God would hope for us. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, had hanging in her dining room a wooden plaque with a poem by the 19th century poet Hawking Miller, which I remember from a very early age. In fact, the plaque that had been hanging, this plaque which had been hanging on her dining room wall for many years, later spent many years hanging in the hallway of my parents' house. Well, I've recently been in the process of clearing out that house, and finally it has reached its proper resting place. and I now have it. It's a beautiful poem. It's one that had a very profound impression upon me from an early age. It's terribly short, and this is how it goes. In men whom men condemn as ill, I find so much of goodness still. In men whom men pronounce divine, I find so much of sin and blot. I hesitate to draw a line between the two where God has not. All of us, we're all in this together. So the youngest son, he returns home, rehearsing his confession, ready for the worst. We might say that he returns home, but if you look closely at the text of the story, the idea is more that he's returning to his father. The contrast is not so much between being at home and away, but rather between being with his father and being away. And heaven is a little like that. Heaven isn't so much about being in a certain place as being with a certain person, as being with the Father. It's all about the relationship that we either have or we don't have with God the Father. But we mustn't digress too much on that. The understanding of the younger son returning to his father is brought out very clearly by what happens on his return. Jesus says that he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. I wonder, had he been looking out? But he saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Let's read that again, in case we miss what's going on here. His father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced and kissed him. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that absolutely amazing? There's no anger at what he had done. There was no criticism, no condemnation, no, but who on earth do you think you are showing your face around here? Not a bit of it, none of it at all. Instead, there's compassion, there's embracing, there's kissing. For the one who has just squandered a third of the family inheritance, brought shame upon them all, and broken up the estate. Isn't that absolutely amazing? You know of a most delightful song that was written by another poet by the name of Samuel Longfellow in the middle of the 20th century. It's a song about this story of the compassionate father. Sometimes we sing it. You might have sung it yourself. It goes, love for all, and can it be? Can I hope it is for me? I who strayed so long ago, strayed so far and fell so low. I, the disobedient child, wayward, passionate and wild, I who left my father's home in forbidden ways to roam, I who spurned his loving hold, I who would not be controlled, I who would not hear his call, I, the willful prodigal. To my father can I go? At his feet myself I'll throw, in his house there yet may be place, a servant's place for me. See, my father waiting stands. See, he reaches out his hands. God is love. I know, I see, love for me, yes, even me. I'm having that at my funeral, if you'd like to come along and join in. And it is one of my favorite songs, but I think it misses one significant point. The final verse begins, you might have noticed, see my father waiting stands, see he reaches out his hands, but that's not actually how the story goes. Jesus said that while the younger son was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him. Yeah, he ran. The father didn't stand waiting. He actually ran to his son, not with clenched fists, but with outstretched arms, eager to embrace him. And why does he do that? Why does the father in the story have compassion and run and embrace and kiss his son? Why does he do that? Because that is exactly how God welcomes back one who was lost and is found, who was dead but now lives. When I read the story, I think of the words of King David, written over 1,000 years earlier, when he says, "The Lord doesn't deal with us according to our sins, nor does he repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love towards those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him." As a father shows compassion to his, and there's more than compassion here. There's a real celebration with a ring on his finger, shoes on his feet that had been worn out from his long journey. The prized calf is slaughtered for a sumptuous feast with music and dancing. Some have called the behavior of the father wastefully extravagant. Maybe the story should be the story of the prodigal father. You remember the lost and the found sheep and the lost and the found coin? Well, here is the joy in heaven before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Here's the father expressing his joy because his child has come back to him, and no expense could possibly be spared for such an occasion as this. Well, not everyone saw it quite the same way. There were two brothers in the story, you remember, and the attention now turns to the older of the two, the one who had faithfully stayed at home since the beginning of the story. He knows nothing of the father's joy, but instead we're told he's filled with anger, and he refuses to go back in the house and join the party. Even when the father comes out to him and entreats him, he could only protest at his own innocence and complain at what he saw as the unfairness of it all. I don't know, maybe he feels cheated. Maybe he feels that his father is wrong for behaving in such a fashion. After all, having spoken of the rights of inheritance of the firstborn, all the way back in Deuteronomy, the law went on to speak of a stubborn and a rebellious son who is a glutton and a drunkard, and how that all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. No fatted calf, no ring, no shoes, no music, no dancing, no party, just stoning to death in order to purge the evil from their midst. All there in Deuteronomy chapter 21. But where the law was concerned with setting in place a moral framework and a code of civil conduct, it never excluded the possibility of one turning away from rebellion and finding forgiveness and restoration and life. That was always there from the beginning. But they were always those who thought themselves to be so much better than everyone else, and who would rather condemn than show compassion. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they were just like that older brother who knew no joy, for they knew nothing of the mercy and compassion of God. And isn't that the way with those religious people that we might know? When God throws a party, the religious people don't want to join in. They don't want to join in because they are so consumed with their own goodness, which isn't really goodness at all, just wickedness clothed in self-righteousness. But when God throws a party, the sinners turn up, for they've come to know the love of God, and they have entered into his joy. For they were dead, but now they live. They were lost, but now they're found. May God open our hearts to see the way clearly back to his heart. May we trust in his ways, even when we may not fully understand them to be fair. And may we share in his joy every time a lost one comes back to the Father. And may we welcome them back to the family as we have been welcomed back by God. For we were once dead, but now we live. We were lost, but now we are found. May God restore to us the joy of your salvation. God bless you. Thank you.